Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Capturing Voices, Evidence Generation for CAAFAG. My name is Ahmed Salim, and I am the co-coordinator for the Global CAAFAG Task Force. It's a pleasure to see such a dedicated audience here today. This webinar is another webinar organized by the CAAFAG Task Force. This one, however, has been also organized in collaboration with and with support from the AME Working Group of the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. We're here to break new ground involving children with armed forces and armed groups in our work. Today, we will explore innovative methodologies, share practical tools, and discuss the ethical complexities and risks associated with this sensitive yet crucial task. Our ultimate goal is to amplify the voices of these children, ensuring their experiences inform and improve our responses. Thank you for joining us. Now, I'm pleased to hand over to Josiah, who will lead us through the next segment of our webinar. Over to you, Josiah.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, colleagues, depending on your time zone. My name is Josiah Kaplan. I am a child protection specialist at UNICEF Global Office of Research and Foresight, based in Florence, Italy, and I co-lead the Assessment, Measurement, and Evidence, or AME, working group of the ACPHA, and we are thrilled to have the opportunity to have worked with the CAAFAG working group to spotlight and hold a bit of space today to focus in on the broad topic of evidence generation in CAAFAG, but particularly the extremely challenging and also extremely critical involvement of children in evidence generation for CAAFAG. So when we talk about data collection for research and learning, involving CAAFAG, involving children associated with armed forces and armed groups in the generation of research itself poses extreme sensitivities, extreme risks associated with their recruitment into research processes, but also tremendous opportunities for informing evidence-based responses through their perspectives. Children in any context, including CAAFAG, have unique insights into their own experiences, challenges, and the context in which they operate. And these contributions can lead and do lead directly to enhancing program effectiveness, informing context analysis, and contributing to more targeted interventions. But we know that this is extraordinarily challenging. And so field practitioners often require additional technical guidance and good practice examples of how evidence generation activities involving CAAFAG can be conducted safely and effectively. And that's what we've come together today to discuss. So we have three objectives in this webinar. We're going to be hearing about ways in which we can promote the safe, ethical, and rigorous involvement of children associated with armed forces and active groups in evidence generation and in the collecting of data on child association. But second, we're here to share methodological good practices, which are often not consolidated in written guidance, but are part of anecdotal experience. And we would invite you to both learn from our panelists, but also share your own experiences, reflections, and perhaps challenges in the open Q&A. And likewise, to discuss the ethics and approaches to risk assessment and risk assessment tools and guidance that may potentially mitigate potential risks for CAAFAG engagement during data collection processes. To hear about these themes, where we are joined by a really exciting panel. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Sophie Bray-Watkins, Youth Advocacy and Participation Advisor at War Child, Siobhan O'Neill, who's the head of project managing exits for armed conflict at UNIDR, and Sandra Mejean, who's the CAAFAG advisor at Plan International. I'm going to ask each panelist, beginning with Sophie, to speak for about 10 minutes on their topic of choice, and then we will open for general questions and answers. So thank you all very much for being here again, and Sophie, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Real pleasure to be here with you today. So in the time I have, I would like to run through some of the experiences we have at War Child with engaging with children and youth who have associations with armed groups. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to start by having a quick look at what we mean by evidence generation in the context of this discussion, what we are speaking to and not speaking to, before moving on to thinking about safety risks and ethics, starting with some assumptions that I think we need to have that would underpin all of this, and then an example of a process, some stages that we could go through, and finish just within a report that you could look at for a bit of inspiration and a resource that we have that could be useful for some of your work. Next slide. So thinking about what kind of evidence, important to say at this point, these are ideas, reflections, tips on information gathering, but not formal research. And we all know that formal research would require a different process. If we're talking about ethics in terms of formal research, then it would be things such as clearance from an ethics board. Your safeguarding practice would need to be slightly different. This really is thinking more about how organisations, practitioners, can facilitate less formal forms of information gathering with CAAFAG. So things such as consultations or assessments, project design and planning. Another point I think it's important to make here is this is not information gathering for content or for communication purposes, which again has a very different set of considerations and stages and things that you would have to do. So next slide, please. Okay, so I think there's some basic prerequisites. I imagine that most of the people joining the call today, this will be the case, but all of the process and the things that I will talk through in a second are working on a certain set of assumptions. And that is that those that are seeking to do this work already have a linkage or a relationship to CAAFAG, would either through their direct work or through a strong relationship and partnership with a local organisation or with a community group. I think without that, it's very difficult to talk about embarking on this kind of activity with CAAFAG. To consider that you have a maintained presence. So by that, I mean that you're not going to be dipping into somewhere, a certain context, and then leaving again, but to think about what is the possibility you have to maintain your work in that area, again, either through a partner or in the work that you directly support. To think through your willingness to turn information into change and action. I think this is a really key point. It's that ethics in terms of any research is about not repeating things that have already been done. So is that information already available, but also that you don't gather information for information's sake, and that is turned into tangible activity, policy guidance, program guidance, action change, that you will be really utilising that information. And then also that you've got the necessary safeguarding expertise and mechanisms and processes already in place before you embark on such work. I think that's probably a standard that most people dialing in today would already have and expect. On top of that, I think it's important to consider how you plan your process around the needs of the young people rather than necessarily the start point being what you want. And by that, I mean that a lot of the time when we're looking at evidence generation, the focus is on what's the kind of cohort number we want to work with, or what's our ideal sample size. Whereas actually for CAAFAG, I would suggest it's the other way around. The main thing that should be informing the work is what are the needs of those young people as individuals and as a group. How will you meet them in the project, and make your numbers and your project plan around that, rather than what you potentially would ideally do with much larger numbers of people. And 3 principles also underpin all of this, which I'll speak to in the next slide as well. And that's that be trauma informed in all that you do, and have a good understanding of what trauma informed approaches entail. Second to that, even if it's not very kind of formal research, is do no harm, and have that lens of what do no harm could be in all phases of the research or the information gathering. And finally, to think about stigma as well, because stigma is incredibly important to CAAFAG. It's a very complex thing, how it interacts with young people as individuals in groups and with communities and families, but have that lens of thinking about stigma and the interaction of stigma on the information gathering that you're doing is incredibly valuable. Another thing that I think happens quite frequently is there tends to be a focus on speaking about personal experiences, which actually is not that, it's of little value a lot of the time. It's much more valuable to work with young people and speak in a third person, or to speak in a general focus on opinions and forward-looking ideas and suggestions, which is much less personalized. And then by doing that is more trauma-informed, and it's less likely to be as triggering for people. Thinking carefully about the inquiry and discussion and how it could potentially impact on mental well-being, but also sense of self and identity. Because for CAAFAG who have left groups and are trying to break away from certain experiences, they'll be in a process of trying to rebuild that sense of self and that sense of identity with them, those around them, making sure that all the activity you do can contribute positively towards that process that they'll be in. And then age appropriateness of all stages of information and gathering is really, really important. A lot of this, what I'm going to present, I think speaks to older children and youth. I'm working with much younger ones, I think would be a slightly different process. And in the time that we have today, we're not delving into that, but that could be an interesting point for another discussion. So next slide. So here is an example process of different phases and things to think through in information gathering. As step one, you can talk about define. So really think about what do you need and what information already exists that's got that CAAFAG voice. Keeping it simple, and as I've already said, small scale is better and safer. Test it with small groups first, especially if this is your first exercise, your first attempt at this kind of work. You can create a basic plan and should, but make sure it's flexible and be willing to adapt it based on the things that you hear when you start to engage with CAAFAG. Don't be too rigid. Understanding, having a research question fixed at the beginning can be helpful, but also consider that an open-ended approach can be really valuable because it can take you to places in discussions that maybe you didn't expect to be, but are very insightful and will provide you with a different level of information. You can, for example, only focus on education or one particular topic that you're very keen to learn about, but appreciate that will narrow your ability of seeing a more holistic view of young people's lives and what they want. So it's generally good to have an open-ended options in the things that you're going to do. Ensure that you're working with staff who know and understand CAAFAG and their needs. It's really important that you've got people in those teams that you trust and that the young people will also trust. So step two, invitation and informed consent. So I'm not going to go here into the processes informed consent. It's a really, really sensitive areas. I'm sure we're aware in the time, but it would be, I think, another follow-up possibly would be to look at informed consent processes with children and CAAFAG in more depth. But as general principle, when you're looking at invitations, spend time really working out their circumstances and their needs before you formalize that invitation and participation. Really think about what those young people are going to need to be able to come to you and engage in those activities. Have a really clear brief and make sure that every aspect of that is accessible, and really think about what they would need to participate. Great way to do that is to ask and to spend time at the beginning actually consulting with them. What would it take for them to be able to engage in this type of project with you? Make sure that you've set very clear expectations and people feel empowered to discontinue their involvement or to withdraw the consent at any point. Step three, risk assessment. So joint risk assessments with CAAFAG, I think, are very valuable because as an organisation, if you're doing a risk assessment on your own, you're going to be missing out on lots of different perspectives that could really colour your understanding of the things that are going on for them. It's also a useful process for young people to be able to think through themselves the risk and for them to keep themselves safe, because it heightens that understanding of risk and engagement in different projects. Risk assessment is something that often happens at the start of a project or a research piece, but really should be ongoing. It doesn't end with one activity at the beginning. There should be regular check-ins on risk, on your context analysis, your security analysis, but really also with young people. So think about working with them to talk about what they could do if they experience an issue from participating. What can they do if an incident occurs? What are the emergency procedures going to be? How should they work with you and contact you if that was the case? Related to that is also a good understanding, and them having an understanding of what your safeguarding policy is and what disclosures are going to mean. So have an idea before you start the work of what you can do if a disclosure happens. And important to that is also referrals, and can be very difficult in a lot of contexts where there isn't a great deal of safety nets or support networks or things available. But really think through, in certain incidences with disclosures, what you are able to do as an organisation and what referral possibility do you have. And then considering wider community perspectives, this links back to the stigma point. These young people are not existing in a vacuum, and really understanding what those perspectives of those around them are going to be, them engaging in this work, and any unintended negative consequences that could occur as well. Step 4, planning activities. So if you're unsure, ask. I think if you plan the activities with those that you're planning, you want to engage, they're more likely to be successful. So asking the young people what they're most comfortable with, what format they would best enjoy. Are they looking for individual, group, mixed, creative, formal? That will smooth the whole process. So it comes back again to initial point on flexibility. Tailor the activities around what they seem to be wanting, or as individuals they feel best able to engage in. It's useful to include one-to-one meets, I think, a check-in at the start and a check-in at the end as a minimum if it's a longer-term project, a midpoint, but something where if you are doing group work, you can still check in with an individual to see how they're getting on, and that's where you can really understand if any issues are starting to present. All practical support necessary for them to be involved. So that's all costs for transport, refreshments, etc. Make it a comfortable experience if they're volunteering for you, they're volunteering their time for you, but also to make sure that your timetable is planned around their work, study, care, commitments, etc. Gathering data, what often happens is when you have the information, a very narrow set of people look at it. And I think that's a lost opportunity, is when you're doing the data analysis or analysing the information that you've got, make it a representative group and quite a variety of people engaged in that process. And even better, work with any CAAFAG that have been part of this process thus far. So speaking to them, if it could be that they're involved in looking at raw data, if you make that very accessible, but it could be that you come back with the set of inferences, the conclusions that you came up with and the recommendations, and cross-check them with young people, because then you'll have a much better idea as if you've understood the things that they're trying to relay to you. Again, with facilitators, when it's the data gathering, if there's trusted people that work with the young people, but they don't have the research skills, I would always say it's better to build the research skills or particular skills with those individuals rather than to bring in those from outside. And there are obviously impacts on how young people choose to share information, but it's of huge value because trust is really, really important. Environment, think about the environment and the privacy you have when you're doing this data gathering. And then also thinking about adding in short activities that can lighten the mood and build rapport. So it could be at the beginning of activities, you do icebreakers, but also other little activities to help people relieve some stress while they're taking part. So analysis, I've already said, don't go it alone. Do your data protection, engage with the young people then on your analysis to help avoid biases, and then come back and draw some conclusions after you've checked in. And then finally, this is a really neglected stage, but a really important stage, is the feedback loop. So if you're planning this information gathering, even if it isn't formal research, think about how you're going to come back to those young people to explain to them what happened with the things that they told you. Consider write-ups that are translated, or even better, read to young people. Use visuals, be creative, find ways that they can understand the impact of the work that they had. And if you've built a rapport and there seems to be this potential of collaborating with them further, then really consider that and think about the role your organisation could play in supporting a kind of more sustained level of engagement. So that's not an exhaustive list of things to think about, but hopefully it just kind of illustrates the kind of different stages that you could go through and some of the things that is useful to think about. Next slide, please. So a couple of example pieces is at War Child, we have Voice More, which is a youth-led advocacy methodology, and we have a handbook, which includes a component on participatory research. So if you're interested in things like participatory risk assessments or joint analysis of data, have a look at that. You might find some useful sessions in there. And then we also ran a project in DRC and MEAC, been running it for 4 years, where groups of young people have been organising their own advocacy and research on recruitment. Young CAAFAG are also part of that group. It's a mixed group, and they've done a lot of work on analysing local perceptions, community perceptions. So you might find that quite interesting to look at as an example. Okay, thank you very much. I'll hand back over.
Sophie, thank you. That was fantastic. And just a note to participants that we will be circulating slides. Also, please feel free to jot down any questions or reactions you might have in the Q&A box as the participants speak. We'll be coming back to those in Q&A. We're going to next turn to Siobhan O'Neill to hear from her perspectives at UNIDR. Siobhan, over to you.
Thanks, Josiah. Hi, I'm Siobhan O'Neill, and I run the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict project, which looks at people's trajectories into and out of armed groups, including those of children, boys and girls, and women and men. We follow people over a period of years to understand their experiences, what type of support they've had, whether that support has helped them reintegrate, and what their needs are. We do multi-method work. So we do pretty robust quantitative work, large-scale panel surveys across 6 different countries. We also do qualitative work, focus groups, key informant interviews. We do experimental work, but we also do a lot of participatory work. And I wanted to share a couple examples of that with you, and some of the lessons learned that we've garnered out of it, and some of the tools that have come out that we think maybe could be useful if others are trying to replicate these kind of approaches. And just to clarify, so we are a policy action research project that tries to bring robust methods into really practical work to support practitioners on the ground. So we've gone through an ERB, but we're also very practically oriented towards our partners who are doing this work and need information quickly so that their programs can be evidence-based, both in design and implementation. I'll just highlight 2 examples from the last few years. So the first one is some work that we co-developed with Sophie and her team over at War Child. This was an initiative called No Research About Us Without Us, and we produced a tool, several tools out of that I'll highlight. And then we've also been working with War Child and a series of other partners on a participatory photography research program with young people who have come out of armed groups or are perceived as affiliated that I'll walk you through as well. Next slide, please. So on this first initiative in 2019, we developed a series of tools with War Child that we later pilot tested with one of the Voice More groups that Sophie just mentioned, which was a mixed group, including ex-CAAFAG who were participants in that group in CAR. So we tried to create a methodology that would allow us to have discussions about young people's experiences, but in a way that it wasn't just extractive, that they would be able to share those experiences, but also share perspectives on the kinds of things that would need to be done for people like them to support their reintegration. And one of the ways that we wanted to have discussions both on sort of recruitment and journeys into armed groups, but also transitions out, which would be very useful for understanding the needs and challenges associated with reintegration, was this high stakes game that we created. So it's kind of like a snakes and ladders game, which has different names in different cultures. But this idea of using a game as a way of facilitating conversations that can be difficult, and they also don't have to be personalized as well. So we did this in CAR, and then we presented it actually at an area formula meeting with the Security Council. Since then, we have made a version, kind of a field version, that's a laminated sheet that can be brought in sort of a roll up and has all the pieces so that can be brought with a dry erase marker. So we can do it with different populations. And we have for the last several years. This was used in Nigeria just a couple weeks ago with girls and boys who've come out of Boko Haram and ISWAP. So this is a particular tool, and I'll share the QR codes for these as well, that you can use for having some of these discussions with young people. I'll go to the next slide, please. So more recently, we pulled together a series of partners, including 100 Cameras, UNICEF, IOM, War Child, local Iraqi organizations, Bridge and Progress and Peace, as well as some of our donor partners, and tried to expand on some of this methodology to work with young people coming out of armed groups or those who are perceived as affiliated with them, to try to better understand their needs so that we could help inform recommendations for practitioners and policymakers who influence the return process, both in Iraq and elsewhere, and reintegration support design and implementation. The goal was to have this methodology interact with the other data collection and qualitative work that we were doing in Iraq, but also to find a way to make sure that their voices were brought forward in that work, that they informed the policy recommendations, and that they had fewer unfiltered inputs into the process. And so we've done this in a couple different ways. If you move to the next slide. So in Mosul last year, we launched 2 participatory programs. One was a qualitative research training to try to teach young people really basic research skills so that they eventually could be co-researchers, or they could help in discussing some of these issues, but informed from sort of what we're looking for perspective. We also did this with a photography intervention. So 100 Cameras has done this photography program all over the world with young people who face adversity, and we adapted it to the very specific context in Iraq of young people who are perceived as ISIL affiliated because of some familial connection. So we ran these 2 pilots a year ago, and actually today we are on day 3 of a follow-up program in Mosul. And one of the girls who was a participant last year is now a co-facilitator. So again, we're trying to close that feedback loop, but also to really integrate the skill sets that they've learned and to make them co-producers of this next round of work. I'll go to the next slide, which has a couple publications on it. So one is a research report, a multi-method research report that we did on people returning from Syria and domestically after periods of displacement, who are perceived as ISIL affiliated, and the challenges they've had and the support they need. And this work was informed not only by our large-scale survey work, not only by our qualitative work, but also by this participatory work and the photographs taken by the young people through this training. Then we did 2 more narrow publications, which were kind of lessons learned. So what went well, what didn't go as well in these 2 pilots, and how we might move forward differently in the future and build on some success, but also some of the roadblocks that we encountered. So those may be interesting for those of you who would like to adapt kind of a similar approach. I'll go to the next slide and just offer the tools from the first set of work, and then I'll just reflect a little bit on some of the things that we've learned in these processes. So the QR codes didn't show up, but this video is online if you search it. So it's a short overview of what we did in the CAR pilot with War Child Divorce More program. Then this high stakes game, we just realized it had fallen sort of through on the website. So it's being uploaded again, but this is the downloadable copy. So if this is a useful tool to you, you can download it and use it for all kinds of conversations. They don't actually even have to be on these particular, reintegration or recruitment subjects. And then with War Child, we produced this No Research About Us Without Us guidance and script. And again, there's a whole script in there that you could also adapt if you wanted to have some of these conversations in a way that is more participatory and can be kind of co-generated with young people themselves. And then lastly, maybe I'll just reflect a little bit on what we've learned in doing this. So first, just to say that in addition to being in Mosul today, 2 months ago, we were in the northeast of Nigeria. So we've expanded and integrated the 2 programs, the photography and the research. We've brought them together into a single program. And we're now using this opportunity this year to do a tripartite program in Colombia with an indigenous community heavily impacted by FARC dissident recruitment, in the northeast of Nigeria with young people coming out of Boko Haram and ISWAP, and again in Iraq with young people who are perceived as affiliated or called ISIL families. So I'll move to the next slide to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned. So just to echo what Sophie said, I think the import of embedding this type of work in an existing structure, so it's not just sort of a one-off activity, is so very important. And again, we come at this from more of a pure research side, kind of coming in, and not from a programming agency perspective. So that really speaks to the importance of partnership in all of this, so that there's something that comes after. But to get to my sort of second point, I think it also is so important to embed in existing structures for consultation and engagement, because so many young people in the cultures where we work are not used to having their opinions valued. Sometimes the linguistic frames for a conversation don't exist. And so you really have to do a lot of prep work to have those effective exchanges. Again, I won't go into all of the sort of the basics of like how you set this up from an ethical standpoint or design standpoint, but just to highlight some of the points that Sophie made. This issue of a clear consent and assent process for caregivers and participants is so important, not only because that's basic ethics work, but also because it really does impact the type of participation that you will have. And so it is not only sort of a prerequisite to doing this work right and preventing harm, but it's also to have like the effective outcome that you're interested in. Apologies for the spelling error typo here, but just to say that one of the most important things that we found in the work in Mosul was also establishing ground rules for comfort and safety. And this really wasn't about the young people involved and their safety, but it became increasingly about our facilitators' safety. There was a real disconnect. This was really sensitive work, but there was a real disconnect between, I think, digital natives' expectations about what you broadcast and also the facilitators' expectations. And so around social media, when working with young people in particular contexts, we find this really requires some additional thinking work and clear guidance from the very beginning. Another issue that we've had in the places where we've done this work is really this need to program to the participants you have, not the ones you want. And this is something that is so important in these populations where young people have lost all of their formative years of education or huge chunks of their education. So they come into this program and many of them cannot read and write. And so you really have to be able to adapt to work with them and meet them where they are. And by starting with an adaptable curricula, I think you're already way ahead versus having one that is way more oriented to an older, perhaps more literate audience, and then having to really make huge revisions. So building something that is very flexible from the start is really important. We found that photographing some of these difficult conversations that you can't have directly full on because they are too problematic to speak about, but without having to talk about my or this experience or I feel this way. So I think that really opened them up. And I think we found it really useful. In Nigeria, it was extremely empowering for young people who've had very little education. And a lot of them feel quite special that they've had this intervention. One girl wrote to us after the fact that she's already been the professional photographer at a family wedding. And so I think she feels really, really positive about sort of what this skill set and all of them have sort of brought forward. I will say, there's so much talk sometimes about the potential to re-traumatize young people who've been through these experiences, and that's really important. But the other thing that we have found is actually sort of a flip side, which is these young people are so looking for an outlet to connect. It doesn't necessarily become a situation where you have someone in front of you who needs to be referred and leave the program. It's someone who is so desperate to stay with the facilitator and be part of the program and have the program continue because it is such an important outlet. Young people who are not asked about their experiences, who do not have a safe place to talk about them. And so I think one thing you also have to prepare for, including the sort of do no harm side and the potential for re-traumatization, is the exact opposite, where you are just not prepared for the amount of need and how they see what this program should be for them or what it represents for them, and having the capacity to sort of support that. So it certainly speaks to sort of long-term structures and the need for it, but it also, from a more research perspective, it's crossing this sort of line that researchers they're not expecting in this particular direction. So I think it's something just to have an eye out for. And again, that sort of idea of just long-term engagement. And it's really hard with, I think, the funding cycles that many of you are dealing with. I mean, participatory work, it should be said, is it takes a decent amount of money. It takes a lot of time to prepare. And doing it in a one-off is just not as fulfilling or helpful for the young people. So trying to plug it into some other structures or some sort of long-term engagement, which again can be challenging, but with a virtual world, there's a lot more opportunities, I think, opening up in this space, or things locally that can be sort of transitioned to. So maybe some things to highlight there, but very happy to talk more about this in the Q&A.
Siobhan, thank you so much. Extremely helpful, and again, really excited that we're drilling down into concrete tools and resources. I'm going to move on to Sandra for our final presentation, and then we'll be opening to Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Josiah. So I'm Sandra Mignon. I work with Plan International, and I'm the co-lead of the CAAFAG task force. And today I'm going to talk about the participation of CAAFAG in the context analysis, and particularly in one tool that we have developed as part of the program development toolkit for CAAFAG. So next slide, please. So if you're familiar already with the CAAFAG task force and the work we've done. You probably know about this resource and this toolkit that we have developed a couple of years ago. And the idea of this resource is to provide field practitioners with some resources and guidance on how to design programs for CAAFAG. And this is coming from the perspective of the field, and then also from various actors, that they are in a lot of places we kind of see the same types of programs applied everywhere with CAAFAG, and not necessarily taking the time to understand what are the actual needs of CAAFAG, what is specific to them that can vary from one country to another. So today I'm going to talk about a tool that we have developed as part of the context analysis section of this toolkit. And particularly, I'm going to briefly mention the tool and how we collect data. But mainly, I'm going to talk about how we use this data for program implementation. So next slide, please. In the context analysis, we have a number of tools, and we collect data from men and women, from boys and girls who are living in the community. But we also collect data from CAAFAG. And this is done through a workshop. So we consult the children in the workshop format. So it's 1 day and a half, or it's 3 half days. It depends of the setting that you have. But if possible, we recommend that we have 3 half days with the children. These are former CAAFAG, who are aged from 13 to 17. In a small group of 20 maximum. And then in this setting, we engage them through different games and different activities. And exactly as Sophie mentioned, we have like a trauma-informed approach. We make sure that children are not asked to talk about their personal experience. So we're not asking questions about like, why did you join this group, or what happened to you after you left, or things like that. But we talk more in general terms. So we say, why do you think young people, boys and girls, join armed groups in your community, for example? And in that way, it's a way to keep a bit of distance for them from what happened personally to these children. But it's also to give them a chance to really contribute, share their learning, and then contribute ultimately to the reintegration and the prevention of child recruitment. So in this consultation, we collect information around the risk and protected factors of child recruitment. So we ask them questions about the reasons why they think young people join armed groups. We also ask them next about how to facilitate release. So here the idea is, from their perspective, what are the obstacles to the release from armed groups? Like, what are the reasons why sometimes it's difficult to leave those armed groups? And then what are the activities that can be done to address those obstacles? So we have like a game. It's a lot of games that are done in a non-competition way. So like these are more groups of children trying to think. It's very participatory, and we try to make this as fun as possible as well. So it's also pleasant for them to think this through. We also ask them about the challenges that they face during their reintegration, and then the difficulties they have, whether it's at home or in the community. And then we ask them, and lastly, about the attributes of successful reintegration. And so reintegration is actually a concept that can be really understood in a different way. If you think about Colombia, if you think about Nigeria, CAR, this concept of reintegration can be can be perceived very differently by the children according to the context. So the idea is for this approach is also to understand from their perspective, what does it mean to be successfully reintegrated? So we asked them about the signs, the attributes. If you think of yourself as being successfully reintegrated, what does it mean? And then we asked them to list all these attributes and then to rank them. So now I'm going to talk about the data that we have collected in 4 countries and how this can be used for program design. So first in Nigeria, we implemented the exact same consultation of CAAFAG, and their children, we asked them about the risk and protective factors. And in Nigeria, girls mentioned that physical violence that is happening in their home or in their community was one of the risk factors that led to their recruitment, as well as sexual abuse and a lack of means to meet basic needs. Things like food, toiletries. Toiletries is actually something that is mentioned quite often by girls as a reason why they join on, because they don't have many, parents don't provide these basic hygiene products on how to manage their menstruation, for example, and they hope to find this money in joining on groups. Boys, there talked about the neglect, abandonment, and separation from their families, as well as when their parents are killed, as one of the main reasons why they joined. Basically, they were talking about how they lost the protection of adults, and then they were looking for that protection in the armed group. They also mentioned psychosocial distress and the stigma that children affected by conflict also face. And with this data, what you can do is basically you can program for prevention of child recruitment. So there is a methodology that you can find at the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. You have a prevention framework where you basically learn on how to use this risk and protective factors, prioritize them based on the feasibility, how feasible this is to address this risk and protective factors, and then the impact this will have on the prevention of child recruitment. You will also find this resource in the toolkit. And here the idea is that with this data that is coming directly from children, and their perspective can be very different from what you can hear in just asking people in the community, for example, and then see how you can address these risk factors so that you can effectively prevent child recruitment. So with this data, you can design your prevention programs. Next slide, please. Then here is an example of the obstacles to the exit from armed groups in CAR in Central African Republic. Their children mention the fact that in the armed group, they felt respected and empowered and acknowledged by the armed group was really an obstacle to their release. And it was very interesting to read the examples they gave. Girls said, I'm respected, I'm well treated by my husband in the armed group. Boys said, I receive a promotion and now I'm in charge of all the specific business of my commander. And now it's for me very difficult to leave because I've been promoted and what I do is valued and acknowledged. And they know that when they go back to their communities, this won't be the case anymore. Girls mentioned receiving dignity kits. So basically all the means to manage their menstruation in the armed group. Why they know that when they go back to their families, they won't have access to toiletries and sanitary napkins, for example. Access to food and money was also one of the things, and then the risk of violence, torture, and killing obviously is another one. But with these lists, you can see how there are things that you can work on as organizations, as NGOs, to facilitate that release. Like this idea of respect and empowerment, I thought that was very interesting. And this is programs that can be done in the communities to make sure that these children are empowered. They're also well perceived by the community. They can contribute effectively to their community. They feel valued. They feel they have something to bring. And I think that was an important point. Next slide, please. Then we have some of the challenges to reintegration that were mentioned in Iraq, where girls talked about the harassment they face because they were married forcibly to combatants, the discrimination. Boys mentioned the lack of access to legal documents. So these challenges are very specific to different contexts and need to be addressed for the reintegration. And lastly, I wanted to highlight some data from Colombia. So next slide, please, which are the attributes of successful reintegration. This is an exercise that I find always very interesting, and the results is so different from one context to another. There, the children have listed this list of attributes, and we asked them to rank them. So there is a methodology to do that ranking in a fun and participatory way, where everybody contributes during the ranking. And there, the first one the boys mention is love, feeling loved by their family, access to education, feeling protected and safe. So you see, like the things they put on the top is not exactly what you would think. Here, livelihood comes in the 8th level, but feeling loved by the family is the first one. So this, and you can see also that the girls is quite different from boys. Their first focus is on health, emotion balance with and the family, the food. Here, as you can see, hygiene products comes also as a quite high level. With this data, what you can do is to basically design your reintegration programs and say, okay, we need, for example, to work with the family to make sure they welcome back their children, that they provide a safe and nurturing environment. But it's also useful to design your indicators. So what does it mean to be successfully reintegrated? If it's one of your indicator, X number of CAAFAG reintegrated, then you can take the first 3, for example, and saying, okay, in this country, being successfully reintegrated means children feel loved by their family, they have access to health, and then, so you prioritize with the children the first 3, and that will become your indicator to measure the success of reintegration. That was just a few examples on how you can use this data. Thank you, and back to you, Josiah.
Sandra, thank you so much. Extremely rich set of presentations. I see we are running a little bit behind, and so apologies to colleagues for not having the length of time in Q&A that we would have perhaps liked. But I also note that I see no questions raised yet in the Q&A box. So I would encourage anyone to pose questions now. I would like to pose as well a question to participants. We wanted to explore whether this would be a topic of further discussion and potential interest in a follow-up webinar on additional elements, unpacking some of these themes that we just presented, perhaps also sharing further examples of good practice. So if you feel that would be of value to your own work, please just note that in the Q&A. While we wait for any comments or questions, I did want to perhaps just ask or invite the panelists to maybe take a minute or two to respond to the presentations you heard from your co-panelists. If there are any key themes or questions that may have popped up, or any reactions you'd like to share. So Siobhan, Sophie, Sandra, any reactions from you?
Yeah, maybe I can go first. I was actually very interesting to hear Sophie, like defining all the key elements to put in place when you engage CAAFAG, and was pleased to see that we, I think, tick most of them in the resource that we have developed with the CAAFAG task force, and being cautious and being really trauma informed, and then all the approaches that were put in place to really minimize the risk, make sure that this is done in a safe way, like also everything related to the informed consent. How do you engage the parents, the children? I mean, all the system that is put in place. I think that was very interesting, and I'm glad to see like the connection between the work that we both did.
Yeah, and I think something that strikes me is finding this balance between being safe and what Sandra's just spoken to and what I was speaking to in my presentation, but not allowing it to paralyze your ability to still work with children. Because what I think we often see is two extremes. One is that young people are just not invited at all because of that fear factor and this desire to protect at all costs. And then there's other examples where things are done in such a free and breezy and often quite thoughtless way, and they really do harm. But there is a sweet spot, there is a balance to be found. And I always say that I find protection and empowerment can work at odds with each other. There's often this kind of feeling of friction in work, research work, programmatic work, but you do really need to find the right balance with the young people that you work with, and it will be different for different cohorts of young people in different contexts. So it's not this one size fits all, which is the other thing that I think became really evident when we were speaking, is the depth of understanding and an insight and value of engaging with young people is massive, but it is very contextualized still, and it does require that very tailored approach. But I think those things became really important in all three presentations for me.
Thank you both. I also have one question that has come up. I believe this is Siobhan to you. Just a reminder on who the armed group in Iraq was that was involved with the study.
Yes, so we work with children and youth who are perceived as affiliated with ISIL, usually because they have a parent or a cousin or a brother who was accused of affiliation.
Great, thank you so much. Let's take a moment to see if there are any other questions or comments. I wanted to perhaps pose a point that I think, Sophie, you brought up in the beginning about the role of stigma and how that informs research on the ground. Perhaps could you unpack that in a minute or two? Maybe just speak a little to concrete examples from your own work.
I mean, in a minute, I'm not going to give any examples, but I will just give a very top line. And I think that the bottom line of it is it's not really considered enough at all. And I think the stigma research is really, really interesting. The literature is really interesting. It's not very well applied to work with CAAFAG. It's not necessarily very explored. And it is a key part of a young person's experience when they leave. And it presents all sorts of different risk factors. But generally, it would be very interesting to look in more depth at stigma and a correlation experiences of CAAFAG, and how you would apply some of those principles of working to reduce stigma specifically to CAAFAG. I know this has been touched upon in different pieces of work over time, but maybe possibly not in the kind of depth that would be really insightful. And so that's one idea for another area to look into. And I did mention the other two, which is consent. I think consent is incredibly complex in conflict settings, especially with CAAFAG, and it's a really interesting kind of area that I would require more thinking, and I'd love to do that in a collaborative way. And then the other one is we're talking about a very wide age range here. We've gone right across from, you know, children. We are talking about a broad range of ages, and I do think it would be helpful to break that down a little bit more, because some of the approaches you use with youth would be very different to those that you would use with children of a certain age. And as Sandra pointed to, empowerment being very important for often to youth, whereas with children, the younger children, the reasons for them joining, not joining, etc., can be really different. So unpicking that could be another useful thing, I think, for future work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I just wanted to share perhaps a reflection for us to take away in consideration. There's two complementary discussions here. One is on how to deepen and concretize and refine what I think is a maturing set of good practices in CAAFAG evidence generation, and critically in the participation meaningfully of children in that process. The second is to reflect that CAAFAG is a space for really cutting-edge innovation and the development of good practice that can apply to many other thematic areas. And perhaps it is because of the extremes of vulnerability and sensitivity in this space that we are looking at very, very cutting-edge practices. So just to say that there's much more that can be said here about the generalizability and perhaps the analogous translation of some of CAAFAG practices to other sectors of child protection. With that being said, I just wanted to again reiterate very sincere thanks to our panelists, to Sophie, to Siobhan, to Sandra, to the CAAFAG working group, and to my colleague Stephanie Acker-Hausman, who's done a lot of work in the setup of this from AME's side. And I look forward to both circulating the content, but also inviting continued dialogue and discussion, and ideally perhaps setting another webinar of this nature for continuing the discussion and engagement. So with that being said, thank you all very much, and looking forward to next steps.